break down 4 running backs and 4 wide receivers that have fantastic overall schedules during the fantasy playoffs. These are 8 players that if you are making a push for the fantasy playoffs, you need to try to trade for immediately before the trade deadline ends. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 10 NFL Pick'ems are already live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em for Week 10. And on top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH are also receiving a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog. So that's a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 10's action and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, let's start the video with Breeland Hall of the New York Jets. And this is a player that earlier in the season I've already talked about the overall strength of schedule that Breeland Hall has going into the fantasy playoffs. So Week 15, fantastic. Going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, even on the road here, not worried whatsoever about this matchup against the Jags, as they have been a complete run funnel and pass funnel defense. Awful overall on defense. We've been seeing this team get absolutely shredded by running backs all season long. One of the best potential teams that we are looking for in terms of strength of schedule, as they've given up the 28th most fantasy points to the running back position thus far on the season. Week 16, earlier in the season, looked a little bit better at home against the Rams, but that Rams defense has started to improve on the season, but they still come in 19th overall against the running back position. So this was looking like a little bit of a better matchup earlier in the season, but overall, I'm still okay with the team allowing the 19th most fantasy points to the running back position there in the middle of this stretch. And then in Week 17, they'll face the Buffalo Bills, who for quite a few weeks now have ranked in the bottom 10 against the running back position, although they have kind of shored that up a little bit, but they still come in giving up the 27th most fantasy points to the running back position. So overall, 3 very good matchups for Breeland Hall in weeks 15, 16, and 17. And you look at the 2 previous weeks between weeks 13 and 14, Seattle and Miami. After that Week 12 bye week for the New York Jets, this is a fantastic stretch. So I know that Breeland Hall, to some fantasy managers, is still very highly valued, but he is coming off of 2 performances of 10.5 or less fantasy points. So right now, he is a great buy low in general. He's the RB14 thus far on the season, and you guys really need to take a heavy look at him if you believe you are making a push for the fantasy playoffs, because this overall strength of schedule is absolutely fantastic. So either way, I think he's a great buy low right now. But like I said, if you're making a push for the fantasy playoffs, go out and trade for Breeland Hall right now. Next up is James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals, currently sitting as the RB11 so far on the season, and he's had a pretty solid last 3 games with 14.9 or more fantasy points, double digits in every game this year except for 2. But at least the ceiling's been a little bit lower in the last 2 games. Faces the Jets this week, which is not that bad of a matchup. Then gets a Week 11 bye week, so there is still some potential to go out and trade for James Conner at this given moment. But let's take a look at those 3 playoff games that you guys see on the screen. Week 15, fantastic. The New England Patriots has become one of the teams that we absolutely want to be starting running backs against on a weekly basis. And by week 15, I think this season's going to be long gone for the New England Patriots. And right now, the Cardinals look like they can definitely still be fighting for a playoff spot. So I like that matchup a lot. I think everybody included will, and I think everybody included will love Week 16 on the road against the Carolina Panthers, giving up the most fantasy points to the running back position. And they basically have been giving up the most fantasy points to the running back position all season long. So these are 2 teams we are absolutely looking for in terms of matchups for running backs throughout the fantasy playoffs. Then Week 17, On the road against the Rams, once again, earlier in the season, this looked like a much better matchup. They've moved up to 19th against the running back position, but this is still overall a solid matchup as the Rams and Cardinals could both be fighting for a wild card spot at the end of the season. Definitely get a good competitive game script, and at the end of the day, it's still a solid matchup. 19th against the position is certainly not fantastic, although that Rams defense has looked better in the past 3 or 4 weeks. But overall, Connor in a great spot, a decent buy low, as the ceiling a little bit lower in the past 2 games. You may have to give up a little bit more for James Conner, but overall, if you're fighting for the fantasy playoffs right now, James Conner is a running back we are looking to add before the trade deadline. Next up is Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers. He has a fantastic schedule, and I always talk about trading for players during their bye week or coming out of their bye week because their perceived value is lower. And the Green Bay Packers on bye week in week 10. In week 9, a little bit of a lower ceiling for Jacobs with 12.8 fantasy points. And for whatever reason, I've talked about this in our buy low videos throughout the season. People just have a lower value on Josh Jacobs this season for whatever reason. We saw 2 higher ceiling games with 20.2, 25.5 fantasy points for Jacobs in week 7 and 8. But ultimately, he's been a player that fantasy managers have been willing to trade throughout the course of the season. So he comes in as the RB10 on the season. I think he's a fantastic running back to go out and buy in general, as the Packers will consistently be in competitive game scripts for the rest of the season. And he's been fantastic on the season, only giving you a single-digit performance once on the season in week 3 on the road against the Titans when Malik Willis was the starting quarterback and he ran the football himself quite a bit in that game. So I like Jacobs in general. I still think he's a great buy low, but then we start to break down the schedule for the playoffs. The Seattle Seahawks in week 15, great matchup on the road here as they are allowing the 23rd most fantasy points to the running back position. And overall, that defense is starting to kind of fall back as the season continues to progress. But what I love here is that week 16 matchup against the New Orleans Saints, as they have consistently been one of the worst run defenses in the past couple weeks and really starting to move back in terms of overall rankings. So those first 2 matchups are extremely solid. Then you look at week 17 and you might say, that's a bad matchup against the Minnesota Vikings on the road. And it is, as they're only allowing the 4th most fantasy points to the running back position. We know that run defense, that front 7 has been very good throughout the course of the season. But I'm expecting a good competitive game script here between the Vikings and the Packers, like we saw back in week 4, which that did lead to a lower ceiling game for Jacobs with 11.8 fantasy points as the Packers needed to throw the football. But I still like this matchup here. This should be a game where both teams are fighting for playoff seeding, more than likely. Divisional game here. Sometimes game script really overtakes matchup towards the end of the season. Packers, Vikings, top of this division right now, outside of the Lions. All 3 of those teams are going to lead to good competitive game scripts towards the end of the season. So even week 14 on the road against the Lions for Josh Jacobs, I still got double digits in week 9 this past week against the Lions. So I'm not going to worry too much about that matchup. Should still lead to a good fantasy outing for Jacobs. So if you're fighting for the playoffs right now, Josh Jacobs is a key running back to add to your roster before it's too late. All right, last but not least, call me crazy, but I did want to include a player who has a little bit of lower overall value on the season, and that's going to be Alexander Madison of the Raiders. And I really would encourage you guys, if you're in a good spot, to go out and trade for Alexander Madison if you're going to be getting a ticket to the chip and making the fantasy playoffs this season. So he's got a tough stretch here coming out of the week 10 bye. Once again, I like trading for players on their bye or coming out of their bye. It's a good matchup against Miami Dolphins, and then the Broncos Chiefs, a little bit of a tough stretch. Tampa Bay is not bad. Atlanta, as you see on the screen, giving up the 8th fewest fantasy points in week 15. Not fantastic here, but I think it is worth trading for Alexander Madison because of the 2 final games of the season. Week 16 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. We've already talked about them and how bad they've been against the run consistently on the season, giving up the 28th most fantasy points to the position. Then week 17 as well on the road. going up against the New Orleans Saints, giving up the 26th most fantasy points to the running back position. And quite frankly, by the time we reach week 16 and 17, I won't be surprised if the Jags and the Saints have both moved back even further in rankings, as I think this season is starting to look like a lost cause for both of those teams. And you could easily argue, I think that it's looking like a lost cause for the Raiders as well, which could certainly be true. So who knows, to be honest, what type of matchup we're going to be looking at when it comes to the Raiders playing the Jags and the Saints at that point in the season. But I think that Alexander Madison, as long as he's healthy, will still be a part of the game plan at that point in the season. And sometimes when we have these kind of teams like basically just fighting for draft positioning and all that at the end of the season, we still see high scoring games. So I'm okay with going out, trading for Alexander Madison. It's a low risk situation. You don't have to give up nearly as much as you would for Breeland Hall or James Conner, Josh Jacobs, the other guys that we talked about in this video. So he's a great buy low option who should still provide you a nice floor going into the fantasy playoffs and the weeks leading up to it. He's coming off of a bad game with just 3.6 fantasy points in week 9, a bad game against the Chiefs with 9.4 fantasy points in week 8. So you really shouldn't have to give up much of anything here. Go out and get Alexander Madison, because I think for the fantasy playoffs, he's going to be a good value. Let's move along to the wide receiver position, and let's start with Malik Nabers. And I think in general, Malik Nabers is a good buy low right now. It's like people are so freaked out about Malik Nabers because in his last 3 starts after missing 2 games, he's had 14.9 or less fantasy points. Daniel Jones has started to look less efficient. We got used to that ceiling. We had 3 straight games where Nabers had 23 or more fantasy points after 11.6 points in week 1. So in general, I think it's a good time to go out and buy Malik Nabers, especially before his matchup this week against the Carolina Panthers. He is still the wide receiver 16 thus far on the season, and he has missed 2 games. He's about to head into his bye week, so you could also try and wait. A lot of people's trade deadline is going to be week 12, so you could wait here. But also, I would just try to get him before he plays the Panthers, because there's definitely a good chance that he pops off in that early Sunday game. But looking at the overall strength of schedule he has for the playoffs, it's fantastic. Week 15, we've got the Baltimore Ravens giving up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. They have just really struggled as a secondary throughout the course of the season. Then week 16, we get the Atlanta Falcons, who earlier in the season, this was a bit of a better matchup. They have stiffened up a little bit, but still giving up the 19th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position and allowing for a lot of good game scripts. So I still like this matchup in week 16. 17, we get the Indianapolis Colts giving up the 24th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Now, the Giants are another one of these teams. Like, once we get to week 15, how competitive are the Giants really going to be? How competitive are these game scripts really going to be? The verdict is certainly still out, but I definitely think as long as Malik Nabers is healthy, he's going to be a huge part of the game plan. They're going to want to see what they have in their rookie wide receiver, especially towards the end of the season. I mean, I think they already know what they have, but they want to continue to maximize his overall rookie season to the best of their ability. So I'm not too worried about that. Even if like Daniel Jones is not the starting quarterback at that point in time, I'm not going to freak out. Still 3 very good matchups here. And in general, I think Nabers' perceived value is a little bit lower right now, so I think it's a great time to go out and buy low on him. But summing it up, he's got a great overall strength of schedule in the playoffs. Go out and get him on your fantasy roster, because he's going to be a stud throughout the final stretch of the season. All right, earlier we talked about Breeland Hall, and now we're going to talk about his teammate, Garrett Wilson, who's currently the wide receiver 4 so far on the season. Going to be much tougher to go out and trade for Garrett Wilson right now. If you guys go back and watch our trade videos on the season, highly encourage you guys to buy Garrett Wilson after week 4's performance against the Broncos, where he had just 7.1 fantasy points. I highly encourage you guys to go out and trade for Garrett Wilson when people were freaking out after the Jets traded for Devontae Adams. And since then, he's had 13.1 or more fantasy points in every game. And since week 4, he's had 13.1 or more fantasy points in every game. So this is going to be a tough buy. Don't get me wrong. He sits as the wide receiver 4 thus far on the season. He's been absolutely fantastic, and I don't think that's going to change in the fantasy playoffs. 15, he has one of the best possible matchups going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars, giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Just like Breeland Hall here, we're trying to trade for either of these guys because the first game of the fantasy playoffs, we should be seeing a high scoring affair out of the Jets offense. The Jags just absolutely abysmal against every single position, but most importantly against running backs, and here, most importantly, against wide receivers. Garrett Wilson, if anything, will have a great game in week 15 in your first round of the fantasy playoffs. Then in week 16, he gets the LA Rams, giving up the 26th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. It's a home game there. Should be a big game for both the Jets and the Rams at that point in the season. So the game script should be very strong as well. Absolutely great matchup. And then week 1, you look at that Buffalo, tough matchup there as they are allowing the fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So I understand that. But similar to the Josh Jacobs situation, we should be expecting a good game script here as the Jets could seriously be fighting for a playoff spot in week 17 of the season. We'll see how the next couple of weeks go, but they could certainly still be in the mix. Right now, they're in the mix, and those divisional games are going to allow for very good game scripts in general, so I'm not worried about this. But if they are fighting for a playoff spot, then those divisional matchups become even more important, and I think at the end of the day, it'll be a competitive game because the Bills could be fighting for potentially one of the top seeds in the AFC. So I'm not going to freak out too much there, and plus, I always say it, while we definitely want to pay attention to matchups, obviously, great wide receivers can still play well in bad matchup. So Garrett Wilson, a tough player. I'm definitely not going to consider him like a buy low or anything, a tough player to trade for, but his strength of schedule for the playoffs is great. If you guys are able to put together a trade for Garrett Wilson and you look like you're making a push for the fantasy playoffs, absolutely do so. All right, next up, let's talk about Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. So once again, similar to Josh Jacobs, I want to go out and trade for players during their bye or coming out of their bye. And overall, similar to Josh Jacobs, Jaden Reed has a lower perceived value as he's been a little bit inconsistent lately. But for me, I've continued to consider Jaden Reed a week in, week out must-start player. In week 9, he had a great performance against the Lions with 16.3 fantasy points. So let's look at the playoff schedule here. Once again, just overall solid for the Green Bay Packers throughout the fantasy playoffs. Week 15 on the road against Seattle, giving up the 23rd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Love that matchup in general. I think the Seahawks defense at this point in the season could rank even lower against wide receivers and running backs. Don't have a ton of faith in them, but we shall see. Week 16 against New Orleans Saints, they have moved up a little bit in terms of their ranking against wide receivers, but teams haven't really needed to throw a lot against them as of late because they've been so bad against the run. But they give up the 17th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Still a good matchup. Maybe not the best potential matchup, but still a good matchup. Then on the road in week 17, Minnesota may be good against the running back position, but they are not good against opposing wide receivers, giving up the second most fantasy points to wide receivers so far on the season. So love that matchup in week 17 against the Vikings. Should be a good game script. Once again, 2 divisional opponents going against it here. 2 teams fighting for playoff seeding more than likely, all of that stuff. But overall, just a solid matchup as that Viking secondary has been very weak throughout the course of the season. So I think Jaden Reed's a great buy low in general right now as his perceived value is a little bit lower with some inconsistency over the past couple weeks. His perceived value is a little bit lower because he's on his bye week. But if you are making a push for the fantasy playoffs, his strength of schedule is very promising. Untrade for him before that trade deadline hits. All right, last but not least, we got a name that some of you guys are going to absolutely hate, and that's DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. It's been a bad couple of weeks for DJ Moore with 7.3 or less fantasy points in his last 3 starts. It has not been good. In general, this Bears offense has not looked very good over the past couple of weeks after a nice couple of games against teams like the Jaguars and Panthers and Colts and all that. But ultimately, I think that DJ Moore can certainly bounce back. I know it's been tough, but also I want to include one player and running back or wide receiver here who's a little bit easier to go out and trade for. And I think that DJ Moore is a good buy low right now, especially if you're making a push for the fantasy playoffs. So listen, I can understand the hesitancy to do so with the way the passing game has looked the past 2 weeks for the Bears, but we have to pay attention to the strength of schedule for the Chicago Bears wide receiver room going into the playoffs. Now, maybe you want to take a chance on Roma Dunze. I probably wouldn't take a chance on Keenan Allen personally, but maybe you want to take a chance on Keenan Allen instead. Sure, that's fine. Overall, the strength of schedule for the Bears wide receivers here, very solid between weeks 15 and 17. Week 15, we just talked about the Minnesota Vikings secondary. They're allowing the 31st most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Fantastic matchup in week 15. Good divisional game script there. Week 16, another good divisional game script going up against the Detroit Lions at home, who are giving up the 27th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Then in week 17, going up against that Seattle Seahawks defense that we've also talked about, giving up the 23rd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far on the season. So 3 solid matchups here. Easy player to go out and target and buy low on. I think DJ Moore is definitely a player that you guys should be making a push for if you are making a push for the fantasy playoffs. Like I said, you want to go try and grab Roma Dunze, that's fine. I think any of the Bears wide receivers here have lower perceived value right now and are good buy low opportunities if you're going to make a push for the fantasy playoffs, because the strength of schedule is absolutely perfect as we start to approach the trade deadline. That'll do it for today's video. There are 4 running backs and 4 wide receivers that you guys need to try and trade for before the fantasy playoffs are here. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. Drop me a comment. I'll make sure all comments are cleared before Sunday's slate of games. And of course, guys, we're going to have everything here on the channel to help you guys dominate week 10 of the fantasy season. So make sure you guys are checking out all the videos. But more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.